I welcome everyone to the study that I entitled At the End of 6,000 Years of Sin, Shall Daniel Stand in His Lot? My name is Lothar Hellenkötter. I've been a student of prophecy since my early teens, and it was a prophecy of Daniel 2 that made it clear to me that there is a God in heaven, because if you can tell the history of this world from the beginning to the end, there must be a God. And even during the darkest times of my life, when I was running away from God, I knew He loves me, and I also knew that I have to be accountable to what I'm doing someday. It is now exactly 20 years ago that my interest in prophecy got rekindled, and that's because of my understanding of Daniel 12. When I read Daniel 12, I always believe there has to be an end-time application to it. It's not in the past like we have been told, but there has to be also an end-time meaning. There are no symbols in it, and that's why I continued to study these issues. And of course, when you study these things, you end up doing some prophetic reckoning. You estimate, you calculate. And as I always liked math, and well, my father liked prophecy, my mother crossword puzzles, I tried to combine all these things to see what's happening in the world and to put it into the perspective of prophecy. But before we do this now, let's say a word of prayer. Dear Lord, you have promised that you will do nothing but you reveal your secrets unto your servants, the prophets. We need to understand your prophets, Lord. And with that, we ask you for your Holy Spirit to guide us into your word and be with us during this study. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. The first prophecy was given in Eden shortly after sin happened, and here's Christ speaking to Satan and the woman. And he says, "And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." The last part of the prophecy got its fulfillment when Christ was nailed on the cross and Satan basically bruised the heel of Christ. But the part before, when Christ will bruise the head of the serpent, that will happen at the end of the 6,000 years, when Christ will put the sins on the scapegoat, on Satan. Patriarchs and prophets, we read about it. Since Satan is the originator of sin, the direct instigator of all the sins that caused the death of the Son of God, justice demands that Satan shall suffer the final punishment. Christ's work for the redemption of men and the purification of the universe from sin will be closed by the removal of sin from the heavenly sanctuary and the placing of these sins upon Satan, who will bear the final penalty. When we study the visions that Daniel had, we see that each successive vision enlarges the picture, and it goes from the beginning to the end. When we read, for example, Daniel 7 in verse 1, there we read that the four winds of heaven strove upon the great sea. And that is a reference to Genesis, actually. The Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And so we realize then the beasts come out of the sea. So it's all coming, starting from the beginning up. And the first beast then comes out, and we see it is a lion, the second a bear, the third a leopard, and then at the end comes the fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, and it has 10 horns, and the 3 of those horns are being torn out, and the little horn that comes out of it has a big mouth. That brings us down to the time when the western part of the Roman Empire fell into the hand of the papacy, and they destroyed the Vandals, the Heruli, and the Ostrogoths. And with that, the reign of the papacy and the persecution of the Middle Ages started. As the vision continues, we see how the Ancient of Days, God the Father, is sitting on the throne, and the judgment is set and the books are opened. So we have a judgment scene, that's investigative judgment. And Then we come to the point where the little horn that was speaking will be destroyed, and the beast is slain and given to the burning flames. That even brings us beyond the second coming of Christ to the final judgment. And then we see in verse 12 that the rest of the beast continue for some time, and till we have another heavenly scene where the Son of Man comes with the clouds of heaven and comes to the Ancient of Days. And we read in verse 14, "And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion." So this is the time just before the second coming of Christ, when Christ puts the sins on Satan and the Father gives him the everlasting dominion. He becomes the rightful King of kings and the King of the whole universe. So we see in the prophecy of Daniel 7 that we cover the whole period from creation down to the executive judgment, where sin and sinner, including Satan, will finally be destroyed, like talked about in verse 11. So the vision that Daniel recorded in Daniel 7 includes the whole cosmic week, the 7,000-year period that I showed to you in my last video. The end of 6,000 years of sin is at hand. In this graph, I included also the 2,300-year prophecy with the 490 years and 1,260-year prophecy, which at the end comes to 1844. The purification of the universe from sin will most likely happen at the beginning of March 23rd, and the beginning is sunset on March 22nd, according to biblical principles. And then midnight, the Passover experience for God's people, will be from April 5 to April 6 around midnight. There's a potential that it would be a month later, but I don't believe so, because spiritually speaking, the barley harvest was not ready at the beginning of 2022, and from what I heard, physically not either. And with that, I would think that March 22nd, 2023 is, biblically speaking, the last day of the 6,000 years period. This will then also be the date where Genesis 3:15 finds its final fulfillment. As all the people on earth will die shortly after the 6th of April, Satan will be bound on earth, and it's 1,000 years later, at the end of 3022, when that period comes to an end, and the wicked people will be resurrected, and that's when there will be, after a 7-year period, the final purification of the universe from sin and sinner. It is a 7-year period because it has to be a jubilee that will finish it, because that's when Adam will receive back the dominion over the earth. A few slides back, we talked about that thrones were being set up and that the Ancient of Days was sitting down in Daniel 7. And we find a correlation for that in Revelation 4, 1 and 2, where again thrones are set up and the Father is sitting down, and judgment is starting, and that's the investigative judgment, I believe, of the dead, where the prayers will be reviewed. And in that context, it also says, "Behold, a door was opened in heaven," and that was the door from the holy place to the most holy place. Then when we go on, in Daniel 8, we read about the cleansing of the sanctuary, and that it would would start after 2,300 days. And according to the day-year principle, that brings us then to 1844. The beginning date has also been given. That information we actually get from Daniel 9:25, as Daniel 9 gives us a lot more details about the whole prophetic scenario of this prophecy. And we read in the Great Controversy that the things concerning Bethlehem and also the time of Christ's first coming should be a warning for us, because it says there, lest by our criminal indifference we also fail to discern the signs of the times and therefore not know the day of our visitation. So we are supposed to know the day of our visitation. And at the first coming, it's been described as a sinful neglect of the leadership. Daniel 9:27 even makes clear that in spring 31 AD that Christ would be crucified and that the earthly sacrifice and oblation would cease. And we read that in the Desire of Ages. In Daniel 9, we read also about a 70-week prophecy, which prophetically speaking is 490 years, a day for a year. And from that prophecy, there is 1 week cut off, and that represents then a 7-year period. Back then, it was the time for Christ's baptism, his crucifixion, and then 3.5 years after his resurrection, then Stephen was crucified, and with that the gospel then went to the whole world. And as there was a judgment basically for the Jews, we can expect another judgment at the end of time, also of a 7-year period. And that brings us then to the concept of that we are talking about. God's number is the number 7, and we find it basically in the creation week and confirmed again in Exodus 20. There in verse 11 it says that God rested on the 7th day and he blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it, and before he worked for 6 days. And the concept of the cosmic week we find represented in 2 Peter 3:8. 1 day is with the Lord for 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are as 1 day. And in Numbers 14 we read also about each day for a year. So we have 7 days can represent 7 years, and they can represent 7,000 years. And Daniel understood by the books the number of the years, and that's what we also have to understand. The last sentence in the book of Daniel talks about that he shall stand in his lot at the end of days. And Christ talked about the end of the days. For example, in Mark 13, he says, "But when ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing where it ought not, let him that readeth understand, and let him flee into the mountains." So the abomination of desolation was supposed to be a sign for the destruction of Jerusalem, and we knew it happened there, and also for the end of time. But we will only understand it after that sign happens, not before. And we know from Daniel 9 verse 2, Daniel understood the books by the number of years. So with that now we should remember the years that are happening, and with that we should know the end of the 6,000 years of sin. So what is now the abomination of desolation? We read about in the book of Daniel 3 times. Once the transgression of desolation in Daniel 8, in Daniel 11 the abomination that maketh desolate, and in the last book the abomination that maketh desolate, just before it talks about Daniel standing in his lot. And we know from history that Daniel 8:13 refers to the Romans when they made a siege on Jerusalem, and when it came to the final destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, there was a 7-year period altogether, and in the middle of that period Cestius had a siege, but he abandoned the siege unexpectedly, and that was the promised sign for the Christians to flee. And with that, none of the Christians perished. during this time. And in Daniel 11:31, when we continue to read, it says there, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And that refers to the Waldensians and then also to the persecution that they experienced in the Middle Ages. And the abomination that makes desolate in Daniel 12:11, when we read it in the context, it was sealed till the time of the end. So it makes sense. It refers to what Christ talked about. When you see it, only afterwards we can understand. And it says, the wise shall understand. And we know from Daniel 9, verse 2, we shall understand by the number of the years. So with that, it gives us the end of the 6,000 years of sin. The question is now, who is the Roman today? Well, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, the bishop from Rome took over the power basically, and he was the ruling power throughout all the Middle Ages till 1798, when he was taken prisoner. We read about this in Revelation 13, verse 3. And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. The healing process started in 1929 when Mussolini restored the Pope to temporal power in the Vatican City. But it says, all the world wondered after the beast. And that certainly has fulfilled itself by July 13, 2022, because the Pope announced then that the Vatican's recent accession to the Paris Agreement was approved. That means he became the head of the UN for the climate change agenda. But when happened that event that Christ talked about when he talked to his disciples about the end of the world? I believe it is Daniel 11, verse 40, where it talks the last time in Daniel 11 about the time of the end, where the king of the north shall go against the king of the south like a whirlwind. And in 2015, on the Day of Atonement, the news commented on a whirlwind tour of Pope Francis, the man of Rome, and he was standing then where he ought not, in the United States, the country where you have separation of church and state. But he was presenting in the Congress and to the UN the Laudato Si, his new encyclical that promotes Sunday worship. Let us take now a closer look at Daniel 12. I start just in verse 6, and I want to point out where there's an exclamation mark, there's always a reference to the end. Yeah, someone asked Christ, how long shall it be to the end of these wonders? And then in verse 7 there's an answer, time, times and a half, and when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. So again, a reference to the end, when things are finished. And then comes again a question, what shall be the end of these things? And I put here 3 exclamation marks because the word end here is different. It means the very end, like the last days of the year. Yeah, and then we see, the words are closed and sealed up to the time of the end, but only the wise shall understand. And before, Daniel understood by the books the number of years. So maybe we should understand also the time and the year, because we have to study the time by the historic events. And then, we read about the abomination that makes desolate, that is being set up, and it shall be 1,290 days, and then a blessing for them that wait for 1,335 days, and then the last sentence again, but go thou thy way till the end be, for thou shalt rest and stand in thy lot at the end of days. And that's what we have to examine a little bit closer now. So what is this word lot? Yeah, it is a lot is cast for decision making. And we find the same word used in Leviticus 16, where one lot is thrown for the Lord, basically, and the other one for the scapegoat. So it brings us to the Day of Atonement, where there's a choice made between the two goats that are being selected. One is supposed to be for the people, for the common people, and the other one is for the scapegoat. So, what is this word lot about? We read in Strong's Concordance, it's pebbles used for systematically making decisions, like in Leviticus 16 on the Day of Atonement. The high priest, he threw a lot for over two goats to see which one was for the Lord and which one was supposed to be the scapegoat. So that's what Daniel 12 is somewhat about. There has to be a decision-making process and a sign associated with this. Here's a summary of the work of the high priest on the Day of Atonement from Leviticus 16, and we see there are summarized about 14 steps, and most of them happen in the outer courtyard, but there are 3 times that the high priest enters into the most holy place during this time, while going in and out through the holy place and the courtyard. The third step that happens in the courtyard is that the high priest receives 2 little goats for a sin offering for the children of Israel, and he is casting lots over these 2 goats to see which one will be the scapegoat and which one will be sacrificed. But the sacrifice doesn't happen till step 9. And so we have to see what's happening in between, because there's another sacrifice that happens even beforehand. That other sacrifice we see here in step 4, and that's where the bullock is killed. And that bullock, it says it's an offering for himself, so for the high priest, his family, and for all the Levites. And of course, it's in the outer court. After that, he goes in with that blood into the holy place to get ready to get into the most holy place. And 1, 2, and 3 stands for the 3 times he enters into the most holy place. But when he enters into the most holy place the first time, it says that he has in both of his hands sweet incense. So he goes into the veil initially without blood. And the incense represents the prayers of the saints, that are the sins that have been confessed all through the year in the type. It is only when he goes in the second time that he takes blood along, and that's the blood then of the bullock, because it's for the priesthood. And when he goes in the third time, that's actually, before he goes in the third time, that's when he goes into the courtyard in the type and kills the goat and goes in to make atonement for all the people, but the rest of the people basically, not anymore the Levites and the priesthood. Here's now a list of things that all happen in the courtyard, all the activities. Entering the tabernacle, he changes his garments, he takes the 2 goats and casts lots over them, then he kills the bullock. Later on, after he had been in the most holy place twice, he kills the goat for the people. Then after that, he goes into the most holy place, but then he continues to make atonement for the tabernacle. He confesses the sins over the head of the scapegoat, changes his garments again, and then the scapegoat is led into the wilderness. This is all happening in the type in the courtyard. The things that happened on the Day of Atonement in the courtyard are actually a picture of things that the work that Christ had to basically finish on earth as our high priest. He entered the tabernacle, that was his birth, and most likely actually was born on the Feast of Tabernacles. Then when the high priest changes his garments, that a representation for Christ's baptism. And when the choices made between the two goats. Yeah, before Christ died, there was a choice between Barabbas and Christ, and so there. But the lot fell on Christ to die, and he then gave his life not just for the Levites and the priesthood, but for all the children of Israel back then. But now in the antitype, it's for the royal priesthood and for all the believers I call it out of the perishing world. When Christ was on earth 2000 years ago, he humbled himself and came in form of a human. But after the cross, when he was resurrected, he was God, the eternal God. And as such, he was on earth for another 40 days before he ascended to heaven in 31 AD. And then on day 50, he entered into the holy place. And that was the day of Pentecost when the early rain was poured out. And with that, his service in the heavenly sanctuary starts. And we read about this actually in Hebrews 9. So Christ entered the holy place of the heavenly sanctuary in 31 AD, and we know from Daniel the prophet, Daniel 8:14, when he will enter the most holy place, and that's the end of the 2300 years. We talked about this earlier, and John the Revelator talks about it, saying, "Behold, a door was opened in heaven, the door to the most holy place." And that's when Christ then went in not with blood, no, with both of his hands full of sweet incense, we read, and that's the prayers of the saints. So it's a review of the prayers of the people that died to see if they confessed all their sins. And as the 2300-year prophecy brings us at the end to the fall of 1844, that must have been the time when the door was opened and Christ entered the most holy place for the first time. The second time Christ goes into the most holy place, it is with the blood of the bullock, and that is for the priesthood. So for the people serving at the sanctuary, all the Levites. From 2 Chronicles 29 and Ezra 3, we know that this includes the musicians, because they are playing the instruments and the watchmen on the wall are blowing the trumpets. From the New Testament, we know that there is still a priesthood, even though the sacrifices have been finished or abolished since Christ's death. But in 2 Peter 2, verse 9, we read about a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people. And in Revelation 1, Christ talks about that he made us to kings and priests unto God his Father. So there is a priesthood, and they are the ones who are supposed to be the watchmen on the wall. And the watchmen on the wall, I believe, are the ones who are supposed to proclaiming the three angels' message. It is the message of the first verses in Revelation 14, where we are reminded to worship a creator God, and that Babylon is fallen, and that for the people who worship the beast and his image, that they will drink of the wine of the wrath of God. The trumpets are also blown every new moon, and especially on the seventh new moon, which is the Feast of Trumpets. And it is always a warning. And on the Feast of Trumpets, it warns of the coming judgment, of the Day of Atonement that is at hand. And with that, it is interesting that on the 27th of October 2022, the United Nations issued their emissions gap report for that year. And it talks about a climate crisis which calls for rapid transformation of societies. And that day actually was the first visible new moon. It's actually the 8th visible new moon since the spring equinox. But as I believe that the barley harvest was not ripe that year, it is the new moon that announces the Day of Atonement. And then the Day of Atonement fell on November 5th. And then a few days later, falling into the Feast of Tabernacles, was then the COP27 in Egypt, the United Nations Climate Change Conference. And during that conference, on Sunday, November 13th, religious leaders from different religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and others, they organized a meeting or a ceremony on Mount Sinai where they gave 10 universal climate commandments and tried to increase the climate justice action. And to show their dissatisfaction from the political side with the movements towards climate justice and towards protecting the planet, they broke these 10 commandments, just like Moses broke the 10 commandments when he came down and saw the people worshiping the golden calf. With that, I believe that on the Day of Atonement 2022, Christ went into the most holy place for the second time, and I believe that very soon we will have a shaking in his chosen generation, his royal priesthood, which then is a warning to the rest of the world that he will go into the most holy place for the third time very soon. When he goes in for the third time, he takes then the blood actually of that goat on which the lot fell to be sacrificed. And this then is the time when Daniel, I believe, is supposed to stand in his lot. I believe it's especially the prophecies of Daniel 12, but of all of them, because they all fall together then, that they will show to the world that the end is imminent and that the second coming of Christ will happen very soon. And I believe that will be shortly after the close of the 6,000-year period. In order to understand the end-time events, we also have to understand a little bit more about the three harvest feasts, which are the barley harvest, the wheat harvest, and the grape harvest, representing respectively his chosen church, and then the believers of the perishing world, and the grapes being the unbelievers. In Revelation 14, we read about three more angels after the three angels' message is being presented, and they are also harvesting angels, and it becomes clear in verse 18 that there is a grape harvest which represents the unbelievers. For the process of the grain harvest, the barley and the wheat harvest, the fanning is important, and that's why the winds have to be blowing. And that's why I believe that very soon we will have a storm come up over God's chosen church, but the storm will basically continue or to get worse, because for the wheat harvest it's usually more difficult to separate the chaff from the grain, as with the barley. This was now a short summary of what I've prepared in major presentations, starting with Unpacking Compacted Prophecy, and I will put the link in the description box. So if people want to get a deeper understanding of it, in all of this, remember that knowledge is progressive, and not everything which I talked about years back is exactly like I see it today. The important things for us to remember is that, before the crisis comes, our sins must go to judgment beforehand. Every sin must be confessed at the sanctuary. Then the work will move, and it must be done now. And I really believe it must be done now. When I put in this timeline of the 6,000 years of sin and these dates with March 23rd and April 6th, it has nothing to do with the close of probation, and not a lot to do with the date of Christ's coming. probation closes for everyone individually, and it will be before this March date I've given. And the Christ's coming will be announced about the midnight starting April 6, I believe. For the people that lived at the time of the flood, the close of probation was 7 days before the rain came. And we read, silently, unnoticed, as the midnight thief, will come the decisive hour which marks the fixing of every man's destiny, the final withdrawal of mercies offered to guilty men. My understanding of the end of the 6,000 years of sin being in the coming Passover season helped me then to see that the end of the 7-year period that started in 2015 in fall was not the end of the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary, but actually that date was really the beginning of the judgment of the living being in progress in heaven, Christ going into the holy place for the second time, and very soon for the third time. And when that will be cleansed, then it will come to the purification of the universe from sin, and Christ being the rightful King of the universe. Since 2019, I had several models to explain the timelines of Daniel 12, and I always had to stay with it because the first date seemed to me so clear from prophecy. Because when I studied the prophecy from Ezekiel 4, I saw that April 21st is 2019 is a turning point in that prophecy, and it gave 40 days through the 30th of May 2019, and that day certainly was confirmed by something that seemed to be related to the 1290-day timeline, because it was then that Antonio Guterres said that we are transitioning to a new world order with destination unknown. And as Pope Francis gave his Easter blessing on April 21st, 2019, I believed that to be the beginning of the 1335-day timeline. And the event on June 14, 2019 in the Vatican, the date when I expected the 42-month period of papal power to begin, that was the time when the Pope declared a global climate emergency, and it has been commented as his clearest statement yet in support of penalizing polluters. For me, it seemed clear that the beginning seems to fit. With that, I realized there must be some truth to it, and I cannot throw out the first date, so with that I should stick with the last date of December 15, 2022, having something to do with the blessing for God's people. So I decided to put in the end of the 6,000-year timeline with the purification of the universe from sin on March 23rd and the final Passover on April 5 with midnight. And then, of course, we have to change the 1290-day timeline, because it has to end at the final Passover midnight on April 5. And with that, the time from March 30, 2019 to the beginning then of the 1290-day timeline, I will have to call it a transition, just like Antonio Guterres called it a transition to a new world order. Now I show here my calculation. I have to use Passover, April 5, 2023 as the end date for the 1260-day timeline and the 1290-day timeline. You see, I only subtract 1259 and 1289 as we have to calculate in that day is part of that timeline. So we come for the papal power to start on October 24th, and for the New World Order timeline we get September 24th. So in my graph I have to take out those 42-month period, which is the same as 1260 days, and we have to add in the new dates and see if we can find something fitting for these dates. That's September 24th for the 1290 days to begin, and October 24th, 2019 for the 42-month period to begin. And it is quite interesting because for that date we find that there is the first UN summit on SDGs, they call it, and that's Sustainable Development Goals for building a fair globalization. And that started on September 24th, 2019. And it was the first summit on the SDGs since the adoption of the 2030 agenda in September 2015. And September 2015 was when the abomination of desolation was visiting the United States, visiting the UN, and also the Senate on the Day of Atonement. So we want to put in now the SDG in our timeline, and we will look now what's happening on October 24th, 2019. For October 24th, 2019, and 3 days in a row, we have the Vatican in the news with Pope Francis blessing a controversial Pachamama statue before opening the Amazon Synod. The Synod of Bishops from the Pan-Amazon region met in Rome from October 6 to 27, and it was during this time that the Pachamama statue that the Pope had blessed was placed in a church, but it was stolen and then thrown into the Tiber River, and the Pope then apologizes for this event. And we have to consider that this Pachamama is traditionally seen as the Andean fertility goddess, which can be roughly translated as Mother Earth. And then on the 26th of October, it's in the news that the top cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, he took exception to Pope Francis's controversial support for the display of the Pan-Amazonian Pachamama wooden idol on a church altar at the Vatican. And it states in that article that the Pachamama is the fertility goddess, which I said before, who presides over planting and harvesting, embodies the mountains, and causes earthquakes. So it's clearly a pagan worship that the Pope has endorsed here. That shows that he does not worship the Creator God, but that he will drink the wine of God and everyone else who follows this example. This brings us to Revelation 13, and we read there in the first verse about a beast that rised up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And in verse 5 we read that there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemy. And worshipping Pachamama, Mother Earth worship, that's blaspheming God, the Creator God. When we continue to read on further, we see that this beast has features of a leopard, of a bear, of a lion, and that the dragon gave him his power and seat and great authority, and that his head received a deadly wound to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and the world basically ran after it. So we realize it has the same features as the beast, the terrible fourth beast that is being talked about in Daniel 7, with the lion and the bear and the leopard in it and the horns. And that little horn had a big mouth, and so it was speaking blasphemies. As we continue to read in Revelation 13, we read about another beast, but this time coming out of the earth, and it has two horns like a lamb, but it spake as a dragon, and it exercises all the power of the first beast before him. So it's doing what the first beast basically wants it to do, and causes the earth and them that dwell therein to worship the first beast. And if the first beast worshipped the Pachamama, then this beast will also lead to the Pachamama worship, to earth worship. So who is the second beast? And I read from the 4th volume of the Spirit of Prophecy. The lamb-like horns, emblems of innocence and gentleness, well represent the character of our government, and the author is, of course, American, as expressed in its two fundamental principles, republicanism and Protestantism. A government upon the broad foundation of civil and religious liberties. The United States has risen to a place among the most powerful nations of the earth because it had these principles. But these principles are being discharged right now. And it is through its power that the dragon is trying to engulf the whole world right now. Let us now look at a description of the two beasts in comparison. The first beast we know is similar to the beast in Daniel 7, the fourth beast there. It has all the features of everything before. And here then the second beast that with the two lamb-like horns on the other side. But it spoke like a dragon, and the other one received its power from the dragon. And the first beast had a deadly wound, and in the second passage it's being talked that the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. Then the first beast, the world wandered after the beast, and the second beast does great wonders. Then the dragon gave the power unto the beast, and the second beast had power to do things in the sight of the beast. The first beast has a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and the second beast speaks also. And the first beast had power given over all kindreds, tongues, and nations. And the second beast causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in the right hand or in their foreheads. But the main feature, I think, is the issue of worship. The first beast worshipped the dragon, and they worshipped the beast, and the earth shall worship him. And the second beast is an image of the first beast. And when we read the third part there, it makes them worship the image of the beast. And so the issue is worship and making war with the saints. On one side, it makes war with the saints, and the image of the beast makes the ones that do not worship the image to be killed. And at the end, we get reminded, if any man have an ear, let him hear. And the other side says, let him that has understanding count the number of the beast. And the number of the beast is 666. And the issue of worship is also the issue in Revelation 14 in the three angels' message. Yeah, worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of waters. So we are encouraged to worship the Creator and to pay attention, to the hour of judgment, because it has come. And again, in a loud voice, and in the last message, if any man worship the beast and his image and receive his mark in his forehead or on his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God. So if we accept the mark that's being offered by the image of the beast, of the second beast of Revelation 13, then we have difficulties, because we will drink the wine of the wrath of God. And if we look at the fourth commandment, we see a similarity, as it is documented in Exodus 20. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but in the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and hallowed it. And in Ezekiel 20 we read about the Sabbath. I gave them my Sabbath to be a sign between me and them, and hallow my Sabbath, and they shall be a sign between me and you. And in the Bible Commentary, Volume 7, we read that God has set his seal upon his royal requirement. So the Creator God, he uses the Sabbath as his sign. It's not a sign that can be extinguished because it's a sign in time. And we read that it is the Sabbath question that will be the issue in the great conflict at the end. And all the world will have to act a part in it. Men have honored Satan's principles above the principles that rule the heavens. They have accepted the spurious Sabbath, which Satan has exalted as the sign of his authority. And as the first beast of Revelation 13 reflects the same beast as in Daniel 7, which was the fourth beast there, it has all the features of the other three before: the leopard, the bear, and the lion. So it has all the symbols of paganism, including Sunday worship in there. And we know that the dragon is behind it, because the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. And the authority is also to promote Mother Earth worship and to have a mouth speaking great things. And I believe that refers to promoting laws in the long run to worship on Sunday. And as even the top cardinal breaks with the Pope over the worship of the Pachamama, the Mother Earth worship, every true believer would have to consider whom he is believing in and whom he is following. That's why I believe that the 24th of October is the beginning of the 42 months of papal power and blasphemy against God. And as the 1260-day period is the same as 42 months, I believe the two witnesses prophesying in sackcloth are the Old and New Testament, especially the books of Daniel and Revelation, that will, unfortunately, prophesying in sackcloth, not being listened to a lot, but at the end it will be confirmed at midnight when God will show the law in the sky and confirm that he is the ruler of heaven and earth. With that, I believe that all the time prophecies of the Bible have found their final fulfillment within the 6,000-year period, except the 3.5 times of Daniel 7. That's still lacking, and that's parallel with Revelation 12, verse 14. I believe that they will find their place when we study the 50-day period within the harvest festivals, because the end of that I believe to be the date for the loud cry. I believe that that's the day when the prophecies of Daniel will stand in their lot, and the loud cry will start to swell up and fill the whole earth and bring us to the end. God willing, I will be able to publish the second part before the dragon engulfs the whole world. And as always, I like to encourage my listeners to study the scripture yourself every day to see if it is like this. I'm just a human being and I have made plenty of mistakes. Don't rely on my word, rely on the word of God. And if you do not want to miss the next part, I encourage you to subscribe and to hit the announcement button. And yeah, it's time to look up, I believe. May God bless you as you study His Word. Amen.